speaker tonight. He is one of the world's most distinguished space artists. He was designer of the Voyager Golden Record and Emmy Award-winning chief artist of Carl Sagan's Cosmos series. He's a winner of the ASP's Klumpke-Roberts Award for Astronomy Popularization and has an asteroid named after him. He's joining us live from Kona, Hawaii. And please join me in welcoming John Lumber. John.
Thank you, Reza. I'm very happy to be here with you. I hope people can hear me. Hi to all those in person and all those online. I'm speaking, as Chris said, from Kona, Hawaii, where I've lived for over 30 years and enjoyed our beautiful night skies, and hope many of you will have the opportunity to come and visit here sometime as well. And as a bonus, you might get a chance to see some lava as well. I'm going to talk about my work as an astronomical artist. Let me start screen sharing here. Let me get into the right mode. There. So I'm going to talk about my work as an astronomical artist, but first what I'm going to do is plug my book. And this is a book that should be coming out later this year in the fall. It's called the Encyclopedia Cosmologica, and there are 4 of us involved with it. William Lidwell is the editor and designer of the book. Ethan Siegel, who's an astrophysicist who writes for a lot of places, is the writer. And then the artwork is by fellow space artist Mark Garlick and me. And the concept is that it's the history of the universe, 100 million years per page. So it's 140, 100 million year slices in the history of the universe, with a full page picture on one side. Let me share my screen here a little bit. And we go from literally the origins of the universe, and this picture shows the origin of galaxies, to the formation of large-scale structure. Here's the so-called Great Wall of Galaxies. We look at the history of our own Milky Way and trace events such as the encounters with the Sagittarius dwarf galaxy, which our Milky Way has had multiple encounters with, and which has donated its fair share of stars to the larger Milky Way. And then we talk about the planets that have formed around the multiple stars in our galaxy, the many different kinds of planets. Here's a hot Jupiter. And then we talk about the other kinds of life that might evolve on the planets in our and other galaxies. One of the interesting things is that radio telescopes everywhere might look similar, since their shape is driven by the function in a form follows function kind of way. So I like the idea that on uncounted planets in the universe, there are radio telescopes. Here's a picture by Mark Garlick showing a rain of metallic material on a super hot planet where molten metal falls from the sky like rain. And Mark's envisioning of some of the inhabitants of some of these other worlds. If you're interested, you can pre-order and track our progress by going to the website listed there, cosmologica.card with 2 R's for some reason, .co, and you can pre-order and find out when we're going to actually publish the thing. Well, I guess I was destined to be a an astronomical artist. Some of the earliest art I did reflects it. This is when I was about 6, and you'll note I had the 2 moons of Mars and the canals, which back in the 50s when I did this was still very much an open question whether Mars did have canals. In my teen years, I was drawn more towards comics, and I'm probably one of the few space artists not terribly influenced by Chesley Bonestell. My influence were Marvel Comics and the kind of posters and album art that was being done in the 60s and 70s. This was an early painting of mine. But I was always interested in astronomy and found myself drawn to that subject matter. I was especially influenced by the work of Carl Sagan and his early book, Intelligent Life in the Universe. And I did some pictures that were inspired by his and other ideas, and basically wrote him a fan letter and suggested how much I had been influenced by him, and he wrote back, and he lived in Ithaca, which was not far from Toronto, where I was living at the time, and he suggested that we meet. And we had a kind of a funny meeting story because I knew he was going to be in the airport, but I didn't know what he looked like. And I didn't know exactly which flight he was on. I was just going to meet him in the general area. So I taped the Drake equation, which is a now famous, but then fairly obscure equation trying to describe the number of civilizations in the galaxy, named after Frank Drake, who invented it. And I taped it to my portfolio and stood in the airport, figuring he'd be the only person in the airport to recognize it. And he was, and we got off to a good start. And he invited me to illustrate his first book for a popular audience anyway, The Cosmic Connection. That was in 1973. And for that, it was only in black and white. So I had to do a lot of new work in black and white for the book. Many of the pieces were inspired by previous work of Carl, and a few pieces were by me and inspired actual chapters in the book. This was one of Carl's favorite metaphors, that the exploration of the solar system that we were engaged in now was analogous to the great explorations of the past on Earth. And looking forward to a topic that kind of mutually you could say obsessed both of us, which was the possibility of being contacted by an extraterrestrial civilization's radio messages. And that was actually the real bond between us, that shared interest in that. And we talked about it very often. I built for him in his home in Ithaca a 3D model galaxy. It was built on parallel planes of plexiglass, and the paint glowed under ultraviolet light. So when all the lights in the room were off, we were just looking at this galaxy floating in space. And Carl and I had many conversations in front of that galaxy, and like to imagine the other civilizations that might be in it. So many of them, in fact, that I started a series of paintings called the Encyclopedia Galactica, which envisioned some of the kinds of civilizations that he and other scientists were talking about. This is a poster that's available from Astronomy magazine, if anybody is interested in studying it more closely. And then few years after Carl and I started working together, he became involved with got me involved with the Voyager mission. I had been working as a radio journalist for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, covering the Viking mission to Mars, and was going to be covering the Voyager mission for them. So I already knew something about it, but Carl invited me to participate in a very special project. And if you look at the spacecraft, you'll notice this odd-looking object on the side. It's the only part of the spacecraft that has no apparent function. It's a box, and it's a box with a drawing on it that explains how to use the contents of the box, which are, there are 2 boxes because there are 2 spacecraft, and there's one on each. and each contains a metal record, an LP, exactly like old style LPs, except made of copper and then gold coated to protect against chemical erosion. And they're intended as messages. The Voyager spacecraft were intended to explore the outer solar system, but as a result of their trajectory, just went on towards the stars forever. So these were designed basically as gifts. And there were a few of us who were privileged to be able to design this gift for extraterrestrials, should they ever find the spacecraft and wonder about us. And most of the contents of the record is music, and music from all times and all nations, at least a representative of it, pieces from ancient China and from Russia and from India and from Japan. And one of my favorites, an edition that I was responsible for, was a piece by Mozart, one of my favorite composers who otherwise would have been overlooked. So of all the contributions to the record, I think that's the one I'm proudest of. But the record contains everything, including rock and roll from Chuck Berry. And intended as a gift, the spacecraft tells a lot about what our technology is like, and the music is supposed to tell what our emotional life is like. And my main contribution to the record was designing a sequence of images that was supposed to show what the Earth is like to the inhabitants. But the first image is actually a calibration circle. If we go back to the record cover, you see there's a diagram on the cover. I drew this drawing that shows how the cartridge and stylus that we included with the record is to be placed on the record, top view and side view, and then how the video signals, that's how the pictures were encoded on the record, how they're to be reconstructed into a picture. And the first picture we show is the calibration circle. Now, what I wanted to do here was just briefly run through all of the pictures, and I wanted to do it to another piece of music that I suggested for the record, a Bach violin piece, which I'm going to play. I know many of you won't be able to hear it, but at least it paces me, and it'll give you a very quick image of what I had to do, which was pretend I was an alien. I was a kind of designated alien in the project, imagining I was seeing Earth for the first time in these pictures and trying to interpret it. So, of course, you'd have a lot more time to study it than I'm going to give you now, but see what impression you form. So that's Earth, at least as we did it in 6 weeks. The time that the record will last is to be measured in many millions of years, but we only had 6 weeks to do it. People have charted the future trajectories of both spacecraft and how they'll orbit the center of the galaxy like everything else over the next millions of years. And over the very long periods of time, it may be that the Voyager, at least one of them, has a good chance of being flung out of our galaxy when our galaxy interacts with the Andromeda galaxy billions of years from now, in which case the lifetime of the record, or at least one of the records, might be measured not in billions of years, but in trillions of years. And even after that, in the far distant reaches of time when galaxies as we know them have all merged into vast supergalaxies, there may be still some pieces of the Voyager record, some fragments of them floating around out there. The most durable thing is probably the stylus on the cartridge to play the record. We should have engraved a message on that. After the Voyager record, the next big project we did was Cosmos, the TV series, which premiered in 1980. And I was the chief artist for that and supervised the creation of most of the special effects sequences for it, supervising a team of artists, including Adolf Schaller, who did the cover of the book. Cosmos actually started as a textbook that Carl was going to write called The Backbone of Night, which was the name that the Bushmen of the Kalahari gave to the Milky Way. They saw it as the backbone of a gigantic beast that was the universe. And a lot of the ideas from Cosmos originated in The Backbone of Night. In fact, there's even a chapter in Cosmos still called The Backbone of Night. But a lot of my work was making the images that Carl would see on his spaceship window as he flew through the galaxies. And this was all before computer animation. In fact, it was just getting started. So we did all this the old Disney way on cell acetate with airbrushes and paintbrushes. Each image had to be done on many parallel layers of acetate. So for example, to paint this galaxy, I would paint the background of it first, and then maybe the central glow, and then the closer arms, and each layer would have some more, and there were about 25 layers altogether, which were then shot and composited in the camera. They were shot one at a time and composited in a moving camera. And when I talk to animators today about doing it this way, it's like talking about working on a sailing ship in the age of motorized boats. You just never would do it this way again, except maybe for fun. We've pretty much been replaced by computers, but this is how we did it back in Cosmos. There were a lot of models that required to be built too. We were doing Cosmos just as Voyager was embarking on its mission. So I painted this model of Callisto, for example, literally the same day that the picture came down from the spacecraft. Here's our art room, and here are some of the Cosmos artists. That's Adolf Schaller and Don Davis, who did a lot of the Mars work and planetary models. Not shown in this picture is Rick Sternbach, who went on to achieve fame as one of the principal designers for Star Trek: The Next Generation and Star Trek Voyager. And there on the far side, if you can see her, is Sue Brown, who was the artist who I worked with on the evolution sequence, which was one of the very first computer sequences to do what became known as morphing, which is now done in 3 dimensions with color and shading. But at this time, doing it in line art was a great breakthrough. So I was working on the one hand with Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist, to try to figure out what is the sequence that we want to show in evolution. And then with Jim Blinn, a computer guru from JPL, who was helping to invent computer graphics, about how to make these drawings so they would work. And then Sue Brown did the drawings, and here's the sequence. It has music, but I don't know if you'll be able to hear it.
Those are some of the things that molecules do, given 4 billion years of evolution.
Well, Cosmos elevated Carl to national prominence, and I'm still struck by how many scientists today still come up to me and tell me that their career was to some degree influenced by Cosmos. And I always thank them on behalf of Carl. I think that would have been his the favorite legacy, that so many people were brought to science, either as an interest or to actually become scientists as a result of Cosmos. And I'm surprised at just how lasting an effect that it seemed to have. Carl's career took a little bit of an unusual turn, and mine too. We could have stayed in space, but Carl's interests became involved in nuclear issues. And that was because studying dust storms on Mars had alerted a number of scientists to the notion that part of the impact of nuclear war would be to throw so much dust into the atmosphere of Earth that we'd have what they called a nuclear winter. That would be a climate catastrophe that would affect the whole Earth. So even if you won the war, you would lose it to the nuclear winter. And it became quite a big topic in the mid-'80s. And we made a little show, a 5-minute animation that presented the idea in a nutshell. And it was shown at the Kremlin and at the Pentagon and at the White House. And it really had some influence on the nuclear debate, at least in some arms control treaties. And it was odd to me because astronomical art can, on the one hand, seem about the most escapist thing possible. And I never thought that I'd have the chance to put it to a use that had to do with actually saving the planet. So that was an interesting turn, a book that we published about it. But then Carl returned to space, and we did a big book about when Halley's Comet returned in 1986, again, using a team of many artists, some of the Cosmos artists, and then artists from the new generation of space artists, some of whom had been inspired by our work on Cosmos. The final project I did with Carl was Contact. I had done the cover for the novel back in '86, but about 10 years later, a film version of it was being made. And my role on it was to design the astronomical animation sequences, especially the opening sequence, which originally the director didn't want to have any big space sequences in the movie, but Carl argued that that's what his audience would want. So the compromise was the sequence that opens the movie. Here's some of the storyboards for it. If you haven't seen the film and want to see it, it's very easy to find. It's just the beginning of the movie, just the first 3 or 4 minutes of the movie. And in a way, it was something very similar to what we had tried to do in Cosmos, but now redoing it digitally. Two of our Cosmos artists, Don Davis and Rick Sternbach, also submitted some storyboards to it. And then the actual sequence was made at Sony ImageWorks in Culver City, where I came and supervised some of the animation there as well. And it's been a pretty well-regarded sequence, been extracted and used in planetarium shows and so forth. But one of my biggest regrets is Carl never got to see it. During the production of Contact, he fell ill with a very serious disease and died. And he saw the storyboards and worked out the sequence with me, but never saw the finished thing. I like to think that he would have liked it as much as everybody else did, but he was a perfectionist. You never know. I did get a chance in a way to do one more project with him, and this was in a way a follow-on to the Voyager Golden Record. And this was another kind of record, this time a DVD, and not intended for aliens, but intended for humans, intended for the future humans who colonize Mars. It was the brainchild of Lou Friedman, shown here, who came up with the idea of sending science fiction to Mars as a way of memorializing Isaac Asimov, who was dying, and a great friend of the Planetary Society, the organization that Carl had started, partially as a result of the success of Cosmos and that Lou Friedman headed for many years. And on the record were primarily stories of Mars, a science fictional view of Mars before we got there, space art about Mars, and then some radio programs about Mars, including one of my own. As I said, I was a radio journalist for CBC and was there the night of the Mars landing, the Viking landing, and interviewed Heinlein and Bradbury and Roddenberry and Nichelle Nichols and many other people. So all of that's on there, including a greeting from Carl, whose voice may be heard on Mars in centuries to come. This is a montage that gives you some idea of some of the contents of it, and two views of the spacecraft carrying it, the Phoenix spacecraft, actually on Mars. Here's the disk, and here you see it shortly after landing, and then covered with dust. And there it stays. If you want to hear some of that radio program, you can go to search John Lomberg videos on YouTube, and you'll be able to hear Carl's greeting on Mars and find out more about these Mars projects. I did one other Mars message project, this one with Jim Bell and Bill Nye and several other people, including Tyler Nordgren and Woody Sullivan and Steve Squires. Hope I didn't forget anybody. Designing a sundial that was placed on actually 3 Mars rovers. You can see it here on the back of that's either Spirit or Opportunity. There's a view of it on Curiosity. There on Mars is the sundial. And what it is, it's an experiment for kids to see how a sundial works on Mars. And the designers asked me to come in and have a hand in designing the face of the sundial. One of the suggestions I made was putting the name for Mars in different languages all around the face. But I thought, you know, someday if there's anybody on Mars, they're going to find this sundial. And why don't we use the space around the edges to leave a message for them? So Bill Nye wrote it, and I illustrated it with some children's drawings from kids on the mission, and 2 of my own kids, in fact, about what the sundial is, why it's there, and a little message of hope and fellowship to the beings on Mars in the future. Humans, of course, we don't expect aliens to be able to read our computer disks, but humans of the future probably will be able to. They may have to dig around in a museum to find out how to do it, but it's kind of thrilling to me to think that so much of what we thought about Mars will be echoing on Mars in centuries to come. Well, another big piece I wanted to tell you about was a mural for the Air and Space Museum, which was the most accurate painting of our galaxy, which I've since updated a little bit to add a galactic star stream to it. We're not in the center of the galaxy, but we are in the center of the painting, more or less, where the diagonals cross, right about there. These blue dots represent a fraction of the planets that Kepler has discovered, and the mapping of stars and nebulae are very accurate. This is the Milky Way as we see it from Earth, blocking out our view of the center. This is available as a poster from Astronomy magazine if you're interested. Here's a close-up of the central part of it showing some of the mapping of objects. The Kepler mission used this on their website to show the search space of Kepler relative to the sun and our little neighborhood in the Orion arm. I guess I'm kind of a galaxy freak because having done the mural of the galaxy, it seemed the next logical step was to make a model of the galaxy. But it had to be big, which suggested outside, and outside suggested a garden. Another reason for doing it as a garden is that in a sense, the galaxy is alive and that new stars are being formed, stars are dying and in the same sort of cycle as plants. So I designed a galaxy garden. Here it is from the side view. You get a better view here of these trees that represent the globular clusters. A number of them actually in their actual location above the galactic disk. As you enter through the Orion arm, which spurs off the Sagittarius arm, here's my daughter pointing to one random leaf. And if you look at that leaf closely, you'll see that there are actually some jewels on it. There's a little gold ball, and there are some jewels. And they represent scaled in terms of distance of most of the stars or many of the bright stars that you can see in the sky. And one of the things that the Galaxy Garden teaches is that you look down at the leaf and you see there's all the familiar stars. In fact, everything we see in the sky is just the neighboring leaves. And then you look out across the whole garden, and that gives a better sense of the scale of the galaxy than almost anything else that I know. In the center of the galaxy, we have a bar and a fountain that represents the supermassive black hole at the galactic center, and here some of its parts are labeled. When you stand at the right angle, you see this gravity well reflected in the fountain, so you get the sense that the jet goes in both directions. It's a bipolar jet. We have many visitors to the garden, and our favorite ones are, of course, our kids who can learn some pretty sophisticated concepts in astrophysics. There are now 2 other galaxy gardens. The idea has been picked up. There's one in Delaware and there's one in Pamplona, Spain, adjacent to their planetarium. I hope you get a chance to visit some of them. And no story of my career would be complete without mentioning my work with Donald Goldsmith, one of the authors of Cosmos, one of the writers of Cosmos, with whom I've collaborated on many books over the years, such as his textbook about astrobiology. And I'm especially proud of the work we did in his book, Worlds Unnumbered, one of the first books to come out about extrasolar planets. Living here in Hawaii, I, of course, had contact with the observatories and worked with many of them, especially Gemini. I illustrated many of their discoveries for a number of years, such as the planetary disks we find around some stars. And of course, I do a lot of sky watching myself and love eclipses. This is a painting I did of the eclipse we saw here back in Hawaii. It was one of the first images to map the lights of the night sky of Earth, running from Africa across Asia to Japan, the most illuminated country in the world. And all of the lights are actual objects. My favorite are the lights of the Japanese squid fishing fleet, which are visible from orbit. And then the stars of Gemini and the planets are accurate for when this eclipse was. And I continue working on this with astronomers on various projects. Some of the people working on galactic tidal star streams have contacted me to ask to work with them around some of this great new field of galactic astronomy, the star streams that circle galaxies. So I still stay active as much as I can, and this is really a great time to be an astronomical artist. I remember the first Sputnik, and when Mount Palomar was the best telescope in the world, So seeing how astronomy has evolved and being a part of it has been just tremendously rewarding. I guess of all the accolades I've received, the most meaningful to me has been having an asteroid named after me. Don't worry, it's a nice, safe Mars crosser. It's not going to hit the Earth, but asteroid Lomborg is out there. Let me just remind you about the book, Encyclopedia Cosmologica, the history of the universe in 140 pages and pictures. And it's coming out later this year. You can find out more about it at that address. You can go to my website, johnlomborg.com, to see a lot of the pictures and art that I've shown here. Or you can go to Astronomy Magazine's My Science Shop to see the posters of mine that they sell. So with that, let me just thank the organizers again for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, John, for accepting this invitation and giving us this talk. Wonderful, wonderful. And yeah, I think everybody agrees that Carl Sagan and others were only able to do this because of your work complementing their work. Artists play so much an important role in popularizing science and getting all these messages across. Thank you very much. So now the floor is open for questions. Please use the Q&A button on your screen to send any questions you have. Let me start with the panelists here. If anybody has any questions from John? Go ahead, Chris.
Well, of course. First, I mean, having dabbled in the art world too, I have to say what an inspirational the work that you did with Cosmos was to all of us. So thank you. It was very inspiring. I'm kind of curious. Do you still like to do physical artwork, or have you abandoned the true faith and gone to digital these days?
I have to admit that I'm almost entirely digital these days, but what I enjoy doing is going back through, years and years of sketchbooks and doodles and digitizing them and then reworking them and adding to them digitally.
Yeah. Very cool.
I would just like to comment that I really enjoyed your piece when you were working with acetate sheets. I like to do little pop art too sometimes, and I use acetate sheets. So I really appreciate your beautiful artwork.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from the audience. They wonder if there was a picture of a thermonuclear blast in the Golden Record, Voyager Golden Records.
No, and that was by intention. Carl and Frank Drake, the two heads of the project, both were in agreement that the purpose of this message was to, in a way, it was our obituary. It was a combination of obituary and dating site profile. And in neither venue do you tell about the worst things you've ever done. The idea is that this artifact is going to survive us. And let's be remembered for Mozart, not Hitler. And there was another reason. Carl didn't want anything that could be misconstrued as a threat, even though we are hardly a non-threatening species. He didn't want any part of the message to seem aggressive. And that was one of his stated reasons for specifically telling us not to include a thermonuclear blast or any explicit references to war, poverty, injustice, cruelty. Never mind the fact that it would be very difficult to show those things to an alien and have their meaning understood. I mean, a starving baby is tremendously emotionally and powerful to us, but to an alien, maybe that's how a baby is supposed to look. So I'm glad I wasn't charged with trying to convey those ideas as well.
Thank you. There is another question. Might you describe online someday how you constructed Carl's personal galaxy model?
Maybe I will someday. There was a period I was doing those models for a number of museums. I did one for a museum in Toronto, the Ontario Science Center, and then I did another one for the Sonora Desert Museum in Tucson. But like everything else, exhibit technology was completely upended by the digital revolution, and people just don't make exhibits that way anymore.
Okay, and you mentioned that you've gone fully digital. Can you tell us a little bit about the tools that you use? Are you using an iPad and an Apple Pencil, or are you using some more sophisticated stuff to do your digital work?
Well, it depends on the project. Ever since Cosmos, I work with computer graphics, not generating them myself, but usually working as a designer or art director with companies or projects that are doing it. So I've been designing things, which has kept me working with whether it's back in the day, Alias, up through things like Flame and those kind of high-end digital tools. In my own studio, I pretty much restricted to Photoshop and Illustrator and those Adobe kinds of tools. And as I say, I do a lot of scanning of old style art and retouching it or using it as an element in something digital. And I use a stylus, a graphic stylus, but I don't think that I'm in any way a cutting edge person in terms of computer graphics. What I try to do with digital stuff is make them look like my paintings looked.
Perfect. Now here we have an interesting question. So one of the audience says that he has an original issue of Murmurs of Earth, which is autographed by all authors, including you. The final autograph he has obtained was from Tim Ferriss, who has told him that that might be the only copy with all authors' signatures. This would make it truly unique, since he could not remember any signing events, either public or private. So now the question is, do you know if there are any other fully autographed copies?
Not to my knowledge.
And by the way, that it's worth mentioning that the person asking the question is Tim Hoggle, our member who was a chief person in Voyager team, and he got all the signatures while he was working on the Voyager spacecraft.
Well, that's a rare piece of memorabilia right there.
Perfect. So I think right now is actually the perfect time to announce that for those of you who are interested in getting more of John's work, he has made a special offer for OCA members and people who are attending this meeting, that you could get a significant discount on getting some of his artwork. John, would you mind telling us about this offer?
Yeah, if you go to my website and look for the limited edition prints that you see there, I'll make those available to you for $60 each, plus shipping. So if you want to order, you can just contact me. I guess you can contact me through the society, through Orange County Astronomers, or I'm easy to find on the internet. And let me know, and you can have one.
Yes, sure. So the instructions for getting this offer is included on our website on the page of this meeting at the very bottom of it. So I encourage everybody who's interested to go and check it out. This was all the questions so far. Let me put another call for if anybody has any questions, maybe from the people in person. I guess they were not able to fully hear us, but anybody there has any questions?
Raisa,
Okay.
I think there may be some on the chat.
Okay, let me check. So on the chat, I see a couple of people saying their kudos and highs to you, but no questions.
And Raisa, we have somebody who's coming down to use the
Okay,
microphone.
Sure.
Oh, hi. Could you share with us what technique you use to kind of make sure when you draw everything is accurate to where they should be? Do you put down the stars first and then draw around it, or do you have like reference, and like how do you go about doing that?
Well, it depends. It's very often I'm working with an astronomer, and often they will provide reference material, and sometimes the reference material will be act as kind of a template for what I do. Often there's or always there's a lot of iteration where the astronomer will say, make that bigger, brighter, bluer, and we'll go back and forth until I get it. And it's hard because one of the interesting things is how things look is a more subtle question. And it often depends on what it is you're trying to show. Is it supposed to be what you would see if you were really there? But most astronomical photography isn't that. You can't see what most astrophotography shows. So do you have the same flexibility that astrophotographers take, or that Hubble uses in colorizing? So there's no one truth. There's a million ways to do something like the Orion Nebula, say, depending on whether it's for astronomy exhibit or a kid's nursery.
So sorry to hog the mic. I do have a follow-up question given that.
Sure.
So it does sound like it's a push-pull between what folks want to show and what they're trying to kind of, I guess, show out, like based on the data. In that iterative process you were talking about, how often do you find yourself, aside from making the art, of course, contributing to what you think is important to kind of display?
Well, again, it depends. If you're doing something for publication with a scientific release, like for the Gemini Observatory, then the scientist is really in the driver's seat, and you work it till they're happy with it. And if it goes through a public information office, they may want to put text on it, and they may want to make different versions of it. But sometimes I'll want to make the colors a little more distinct, or use the colors to differentiate things in structure that I think are important to show. I mean, traditionally, the role of illustration in science, and why the camera didn't make it obsolete, is that to the camera, all details are equal. But to the artist, you can suppress irrelevant details. You can emphasize important details in the same way that a medical illustrator showing human anatomy can make the blood vessels that the student is interested in learning about more prominent in the illustration than they might be to the eye, because you're trying to teach them where they are. So depending on how didactic the piece is versus how just eye candy it is, whether it's a new discovery or something very fanciful out of my own imagination, it really depends on the piece, how much artistic license I can take. Sometimes a lot, sometimes very little.
We have another person here.
First of all, I'd like to tell you how much I've enjoyed your work over the years. Is there any, can you give us any insight as to whether or not you had a relationship or were influenced by Chesley Bonestell?
I really wasn't. I mean, I had seen his work, but as maybe is clear from a lot of my work, I'm more interested in showing ideas. I mean, sort of apart from galaxies, which I'm just in love with galaxies, but I wasn't ever as much interested as what would it look like on Mars if you were standing there, as much as why are we going to Mars? So I didn't view my role as being a sort of a pseudo camera. Sometimes there was a great push. I sort of had to do that, and in a lot of cases, that's what the market wanted, and that's what people wanted. So I had to learn to do that, but it was never really where my heart was. My heart was doing the kind of more idea and conceptual oriented pieces. But of course, I learned about Chesley, and as I started meeting other artists, I saw how influential he was to them. And it would be false to deny that I don't admire his work, but especially when I was starting out and getting the sense of what it was I wanted to do, I was more influenced by people like Salvador Dali and Jim Steranko and some of the psychedelic artists of the time.
Thank you very much. It's a thrill to talk to you.
It looks like there may be a few more Q&As.
I do have some more questions from the audience. So somebody says the discussion about whether to include a thermonuclear explosion image on the Voyager record was very interesting. Can you describe generally the discussions you and the team had to define and describe the objectives and philosophy of the images and messages included on the record?
It would have been nice if we had any time to do that, but we didn't. The crazy thing about the project was you're making something to last for 1 billion years and you have 6 weeks to do it, and no budget and very little staff. So it is not best viewed as a NASA project. NASA projects have many layers of review. They're carefully planned. There's a lot of oversight. There was none of that. This was more like a bunch of people getting together and doing an art project in a very short amount of time. So there was a lot of trust that we had in each other. Carl and Frank were, luminaries in the field, and they had really set the tone of what SETI and extraterrestrial messaging should be like, with the Pioneer plaque and the Arecibo message and their writings. So they more or less set the tone. And then it was a lot, for me anyway, a lot of individual decisions. As far as the pictures went, we polled a bunch of people, what things should we include? And I think the list was probably similar to what most people would say, animals, landscapes, cities, so forth. There were some individual suggestions, especially from Philip Morrison from MIT, who suggested the page from the book. In fact, which specific page from which book, a book by Isaac Newton, showing for the first time how to launch something into orbit with a diagram that might actually be understandable. So there were a number of other people who contributed specific ideas to it, but it was cobbled together from the inside out, not theoretically organized from the top down.
Interesting. Thank you. Next, we have a question about Encyclopedia Galactica. So the questioner wants to know if it's the actual precursor to that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is well known as the standard repository of all wisdom and knowledge.
The term Encyclopedia Galactica had been floating around ever since Isaac Asimov used it in the Foundation trilogy. And no doubt Douglas Adams, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide, was familiar with it. Carl sort of picked up the term and started running with it. And then he and I put our own interpretation on it. But I don't think that Douglas Adams, when did I first hear Hitchhikers Died? Around 1980, I guess. And if there was any cross-pollination from the Sagan orbit, I don't know about it. I tend to think not.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, did Giuseppe Cocconi, Philip Morrison, or Enrico Fermi ever collaborated with Sagan?
Philip Morrison, definitely. Philip Morrison collaborated with Carl on a book called Mars and the Mind of Man, which was in a way a precursor to our Visions of Mars DVD on Mars. And it had people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, talking about the importance of Mars in human culture and history. And Morrison was one of the founding fathers of SETI and definitely influenced Carl a lot. I had lunch with them together a few times at Carl's home in Ithaca, and it was amazing hearing the two of them talk, just two of the smartest men I ever knew, just bandying ideas back and forth. It was a joy to watch.
Thank you. And next question is, who are some of the people you talk to now that Carl is gone about the possibility of contact with extraterrestrial life?
You know, there's kind of a subculture of people, independent researchers and some scientists who are interested in SETI. But I have to say, it seems to me that there's been a decrease of interest in SETI. And I think there are two reasons for it. One is the failure to find anything, despite a lot of projects. Now, you can say the universe is very big and we've hardly explored a lot. But at the same time, there have been a lot of searches for a lot of years, well-funded, and we've just come up empty. And I think that's been a kind of a discouraging thing that's in the community. It would be wrong to deny it. I remember when I went to Frank Drake's 50th celebration of Ozma in 2010, one of the things that people were commenting on was how few young scientists were getting into SETI, because it seemed like a career ender. Why spend your career on something where you may have no publishable results except your instrumentation? So the truth is, there aren't a lot of people around who are still interested in talking about it. There are some. Some of the most productive conversations I've had recently have been with Ethan Siegel, the author of the Encyclopedia Cosmologica, who takes a more pessimistic view of life in the universe than Carl did. And we've had some very interesting conversations about the Drake equation and updating it and the likelihood of life, which in some senses seems even more likely. So many of the discoveries we've made are all in support of lots of planets, lots of habitable planets, lots of biochemistry, lots of amino acids and meteorites. You know, everything seems suggestive of it, but that magic missing link, there's still a lot of people who are very skeptical about it.
Thank you. And the next question is from the owner of that unique piece, who, as I mentioned, was one of the chief engineers on the Voyager spacecraft. On a talk he recently gave, he was asked a question that was not able to answer about the record. So what is the speed at which the Voyager record was to be played to get the accurate musical rendition?
16 2/3, which is half the speed of an LP, 33 1/3. And that was one of the great contributions that Frank made. Frank was the Thomas Edison of the project. He was the one who figured out how to do it, how to do everything about doing it. And he, one of the challenges in doing the pictures, for example, was when they first asked me to come on board, they thought they could send 10 pictures. And then what happened was Frank kept figuring out ways to fit more pictures on. And one of the ways was to reduce the playing time to half speed. For a slight loss of fidelity in the music, you gained, you've virtually doubled the contents of the record. So that was a trade-off that they decided was worth making. So the answer is 16 2/3.
We can't hear you, Raisa.
Sorry. Thank you. And we have another question. Do you have anything to say about the future of astronomy from land-based telescopes? And the questioner is from Hawaii.
Well, I think the future for land-based telescopes is bright. We're developing these giant mirrors and actually getting some of them to work in Chile. I don't think there will be one on Mauna Kea. I don't think the TMT has a chance of being built here at this time. And but I think I hope that it gets built, and I hope that's just a temporary setback and they find a suitable location. The Canary Island one seems pretty good. But I think that ground-based telescopes have kind of kept pace with their space-based counterparts. I mean, not taking anything away from Hubble or the glories of Webb, it's just amazing to me what ground-based observing is capable of doing now. And there's always going to be a role for it, just as there's always going to be a role for the smaller observatories that study a lot of the objects that are still profitably studied by telescopes, which can't match the big boys, but still have a lot of great science to do. So I think the future of astronomy looks bright.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And what a great answer to end the meeting with. The future looks bright. And I would like to thank everybody in attendance for joining us and hearing John. I wish you all great times ahead. Please check the calendar on our website, ocastronomers.org, for all the events and information to join. I again want to thank John very much for joining us and doing this talk. Before ending the meeting, John, do you have any final remarks?
No, just it was a joy to do, and best wishes to everybody.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye, everybody.